great panel here today to answer the question of can we have pensions adequacy and growth, which is a great question if, like me, you've become fascinated by pensions, and hopefully that is the people in this room as well. But we've got a great panel for answering that. We're very grateful to the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and the IFOA for sponsoring this event. And we have Alexandra Miles, who's the chair of the IFOA's Pensions Gap Working Party. And we also have Joanna, Elson from Independent Age, and Torsten Bell, the Minister for Pensions. So I'm going to start with you, Alexandra. How do you see this dual challenge of adequacy and growth? Is it possible we can have both? Are we asking too much?
Hi, everybody. So I'm here representing Actuaries, and I thought before I kicked off with my thoughts on adequacy and growth, a quick joke about Actuaries.
We love a joke about Actuaries.
Start with a joke and we'll go from there. So what's the difference between an introverted and an extroverted actuary at a party? The introverted actuary is looking at their shoes, an extroverted actuary is looking at yours. This sort of explains the kind of challenge that actuaries, I think, have had in the past. We have deep expertise and experience on a broad range of topics, including pensions, insurance, and investment, but maybe have been slightly shy and forthcoming with our thoughts on those and sharing them with everybody else. But I hope to change that with the work that we're doing in the Pensions Gap Working Party and other working parties that I'm involved in. So recent publications the actuaries have presented include the Great Risk Transfer, looking at the risk transfer between institutions and individuals. We've also done a thematic review on pensions on divorce, which is a huge topic and hugely influential when we think about pensions adequacy more broadly. And then I have to do a shout out to research from my own Pensions Gap Working Party, launched last week, phase 2, which is amazing ethnographic research focused on telling the human stories behind the pensions gap. And I'll bring out a few of our key learnings from that research today. So I thought I'd share some observations on what I've read and researched and the conversations I've been having over recent months. So starting with system design versus individual choice. So I think pensions, obviously a great invention of the 20th century, but maybe not fit for purpose for the 21st century. And when we think about the systems and structures we have in place and the growing numbers that maybe don't fit that ideal, so Victorian ideal of a typical man, sole owner, working full time and maybe with one employer from cradle through to grave, who fits that mold? These days, probably an increasing proportion don't, so that challenges the system. And then when you have a think about individual choice, if the system doesn't bear you or have you front and centre, maybe that individual choice is a bit harder to make and challenging. And then when we have a think about other things like the cost of living crisis and specific costs, so for example, childcare costs, many people maybe don't have as much choice as people might believe. Second point I want to make is the institution to individual and the switch that's been made in terms of risk and responsibility from one to the other, and a question about maybe that not being the most efficient. I'm talking here about private sector DC, and a potential question I think about whether it is a pension that people get at the end of that. Something that came out of the research that we did through the Pensions Gap Working Party was feelings of shame that individuals have with really struggling with the system and not making it work for them and not knowing where to start. And the sort of lack of relational aspects of money and pensions when it comes to individually having to find your way. And then you've obviously got the broader context of pensions in connection with somebody planning for retirement, which definitely isn't just about pensions. So I think there's more of a role for collectivism moving forward into pensions, which we've seen kind of thoughts CDC, and also something we mentioned in the research we launched last week was having a think about community pensions, perhaps, as a way of harnessing the kind of collectivism. People who fall out of the mainstream systems, maybe there's a way of getting them to save collectively. Then we've got growing gaps between the haves and have-nots. So So this is health and wealth. So health, we've got a difference in healthy life expectancy of about 19 years in the UK, 9 years when you look at actual life expectancy. And that's growing, not shrinking over time. It calls into question a growing proportion that aren't on track for a basic dignified retirement. When I talk about dignified retirement, I like to think to the research that Professor Matt Padley and his team at University of Loughborough do every year and have been doing for about 20 years now. And they come up with the amount of money that someone might need for a dignified retirement. And housing, we all know that a significant proportion of the UK are going to be private renters, and that greatly increases the amount of money you need to have saved. 4 key words: choice, connection, opportunity, and security are key to a dignified retirement. I guess there's a broader elephant in the room that I'd like to touch on is the demographic shifts that we see, not just in the UK, but globally, and the impact that has on what good looks like when you get to retirement, or what retirement actually means moving forward. So kind of declining fertility rates, aging populations, falling dependency ratios, and then the impact, I guess, generationally on making it fiscally sustainable. And then also touching on changes in terms of workforce participation. So the opportunities to reskill, work longer, but also having a phased retirement, not a cliff edge event, and how we might enable that more in the systems and structures we have in place. And then I have to touch on generative AI, which may be a bit unusual for a pensions adequacy event, but I think is key to having to think about workforce participation moving forward. And I read a really interesting report by Stanford University recently looking at the impact of generative AI on workforces in the US, looking at payroll data, and those most at risk. So they were looking at customer service operators and computer programmers, already seeing 13% decline in young, particularly, not old. And then finally it brings me to growth and the link to adequacy and also retirement. Great paper by McKinsey published earlier this year looking at the underlying factors that drive economic growth and GDP per capita. And they have 3 main factors. So age mix, so that's already a drag on economic growth. Labour intensity, so how much we work every week. And they estimate to keep up with current economic growth, we need to each work 1.5 hours extra per week. And then finally, productivity. In terms of productivity, we need to roughly double productivity moving forward to have similar levels of growth. So kind of big picture, big themes going on that impact on adequacy, growth, and kind of retirement more general. So a discussion on reimagining retirement for the 21st century, I think, is something that we need to have, and look forward to the Pensions Commission giving their thoughts in the coming months. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. I think there's lots that's really interesting there. I think that theme that you described of the shift from the idea of a pension as a community thing. I mean, if I go back to when I started work, I think in my mind the pensions are sort of was paternalistic thing the company was doing and you were just entitled to. And obviously now if you're starting work today, you have a completely different relationship with your pension. It's just your thing. In fact, it's a savings account rather than something you're collectively. So I do wonder how that's going to change things over time. I'm sure we'll come back to this topic. Joanna, I'm going to turn to you. Welcome to Victoria Jonson from People's Flagship. I know your train is late, so I'm going to let you catch your breath. We'll go to Torsten and we'll come back to you. But,
great, thank you.
Joanna, how do you see this challenge of adequacy and growth?
Great, thank you very much, Theo. Really so interesting to hear what Alexandra had to say. And I guess my job is, so I should say, I run a charity called Independent Age, so that's a UK-wide charity which is focusing on poverty and later life. So we have the evidence from the helpline we have, from the grants we give to charities across the UK that tackle this problem. And I guess the first thing to say is, and we've heard it a little bit from Alexandra already, the demographics are shifting pretty fast, aren't they? So if you only look at housing and the rise of the numbers of older people in the private rented sector, it's pretty shocking. So one of the highest, I think the second highest age range in terms of rising up more people private renting is the over 65s, and I think the one below that is the 60s to 64. So, you know, that's pretty shocking and has some pretty significant implications for the future. And I guess the other thing we do then is to have a little think about, well, what is the impact of that and the other pressures that people face, and what can we do about that? Because we know, looking at listening to the people who call our helpline and doing a bit of research around that, that there are 6 groups of people who are most likely to be in poverty in later life. It won't come as a surprise to any of you, but it's, you know, minority ethnic people, it's single women, it's private renters, it's carers, it's people with long-term conditions, and so on. And so thinking about them and how we make sure that those people are adequately catered for is an important part of this. You know, I think we'd all agree that we would like to see everybody live with dignity, choice and purpose in later life. And there are some simple things we could do about that, and there are some ones that take longer. So we're at a great point, aren't we? So we've got the Pensions Commission has kicked off. We've got the government looking again at what we do about state pension age. There's plenty for us to grapple with. But there are also some pretty straightforward short-term things we can do. So some of you will have read the IFS's latest pensions review, and they call out things like enhancing universal credit for those just under the state pension age to ease that transition, particularly if the state pension age rises. So those are some of the things we could do, and pretty practical things like tackling the social security system. So we published this report, Jumping Through Hoops, a little while ago, and that's, you know, very practical things that we could do to make it easier for those hundreds of thousands of people who aren't claiming what they're entitled to make sure they are, because it all adds up to this picture of have people got enough to live on in later life. So that probably is enough to kick us off. Very happy to come in later.
Right. Torsten, before I come to you, so you know, we heard from both Alexandra and Joanna, the demographics are unavoidable, and sort of they are heading in one direction. We have the ratio of pensioners to people in work is changing. The government, what we heard over the last sort of week is we're going to crack down on migration. We're going to crack down on, particularly on illegal migrants working, but also make it harder for lawful migrants to work, leave to remain, and so on might change. The 2-child cap is still in place, also a demographic break. So the government seemed to be sort of pushing down on one end, but still remain committed to the triple lock forever. So how are you going to solve this? How does that maths work? Yeah, you can use that one.
That was an impressive effort to ram in a long list of questions. But I've been around long enough, so I'm going to segue past that. I was going to start this question about adequacy, but I'm not going to lie, it's already quite an inadequate audience, because do you have any idea how many scones are left at the back of this room? And you've just left them there. Economists say that no one leaves money on the floor, but it turns out you do. On the big picture question on, I do think, by the way, I just be careful on this, like on this demographics is destiny thing, by the way. It is obviously true that the direction of travel is, but lots of people have been very confidently drawing demographic forecasts for a very long time, and they have been even more wrong than most economics forecasts. So I would just put a little bit of dent in the confidence. When people tell me it's exactly X, I say that's interesting. Now go and look at one 10 years ago, and then come back and tell me you're absolutely 100% confident about what happens in the next 10 years. But now on the big picture question, growth and adequacy, I think the blindingly obvious answer is that they are not in tension. Because at the most basic level, like we tend to think of in the pensions industry, we tend to think about adequacy in terms of replacement rates and the rest, obviously. But for people, the most fundamental measure of adequacy is their living standards in retirement. And so just to be clear, low growth has been terrible for pensioners' living standards. Like, why has absolute poverty amongst pensioners stopped falling? When I got involved in politics first in the mid-2000s, you would have assumed that absolute poverty amongst everybody, including pensioners, would just fall every single year. Okay, relative poverty was falling fast, so I'll come back to in the 2000s, but absolute poverty amongst pensioners has stopped falling. And the reason it stopped falling was because the economy as a whole did not grow under the last 15 years of a Conservative government. So growth and adequacy at the most basic level are very much about the same thing. Lots of people's pensions are up very in line with earnings in the case of state pensions. That's a blindly obvious link, but people live in households with some people earning, some people not, and all the rest. So they're not in there. When it's set up as like, oh, working age population needs growth, pensioners don't, that is just the evidence of the last 15 years should have told you that was total garbage. When it comes to what's going on, I would think about this question of adequacy in two different chunks. So there's adequacy for today's pensioners, where there's everybody living with cost of living pressures, all generations living with cost of living pressures at the moment, and those are obviously particularly acute when it comes to the cost of essentials, and that does make a real difference, particularly for poorer pensioners. So that's why the triple lock for this Parliament is existing. That's the £1,900 increase in the new state pension, the full rate of the new state pension, but it's also why pension credit is still important, why lots of work, including with the likes of Joanna and others, has been going on over the last year. We saw 60,000 more awards for pension credit in the year to July than we did in the year previously. Everyone said it was impossible to raise the number of people being awarded. That turned out not to be true. I would also just say, when you're thinking about adequacy for pensioners, housing is really important and doesn't show up in most of our measures of inadequacy. But more importantly, in the short term, public services. What is the biggest disgrace, the biggest letdown of pensioners over the last 15 years, when everyone was saying, oh, pensioners have never had it so good? The state of the NHS. Right? That is the biggest betrayal of today's generation of pensioners. That's why there's £29 billion going into the NHS under this government. So that's on today's pensioners. On tomorrow's pensioners, I basically broadly agree with what Alexandra said about you should think in terms of systems, not just in terms of what it means for individuals. Obviously, the good news, if you take the last 25 years, is pensioner poverty halving in the first decade of this century. Huge change. Remember, in the 1990s, poor children and poor pensioners were the dual problems facing the country when it came to poverty. Pensioner poverty halves and has stayed broadly halved since 2010, although it did increase in the last from 14 to about 16% over the course of the Tory government. Then the other bit of good news is obviously on people actually saving into a system, because the Turner Commission, the Pension Commission, did set us back on track to be a country where workplace saving existed. And as I'll come on to, yes, it's individualised to a significant degree, but it is also pretty automatic enrolment is heading towards the compulsion end of the market. It's not a totally individualised system. Firms don't get to choose whether they save. The reason that system has been chosen is because it drives very significant increase in savings rates. We're now at 89% of private employees saving, up from 42% before. So a doubling. Right? It's a very big change in systems terms. But it is not. The job is not done. I hope most people know that. Why is it not done? Well, let's just go through some of the headlines. So incomes are still too low. So if we look ahead to 2050, it looks like that generation of retirees entering retirement will enter with lower incomes in terms of their private pension incomes than those retiring this year. Right? That isn't what progress should look like, obviously. That is what we need to make sure doesn't happen. It is not just about income levels, it's about risks being too high, which is the point that Alexandra and Theo made powerfully. We should distinguish between different kinds of risks. So everybody now bears almost all of their own investment risk. What happens to their saving pots as they grow? That is difficult to manage, but not totally impossible. They then bear a second risk if you're retiring just on a defined contribution pot, which is obviously your longevity risk. How long you're going to live? How do you make sure you don't consume too little in the early years? You see significantly happening in Australia. How do you make sure you don't run out of money if you happen to live too long? That longevity risk at the individual level is basically impossible for individuals to manage. Even really rich people, they can manage in the sense that they'll keep eating, but they will probably underconsume. So it's not just that for everybody, managing individual longevity risk doesn't make a lot of sense. And then thirdly, the system's too unequal. And you see that most acutely in people who are just totally out of the system. That's mainly about low earners, the self-employed, and the rest. And then broadly, what we have created so far successfully is a system of small savings pots. And what we need to turn that into is a system of pensions. And that is what we're in the business as a government of doing. How are we doing that? Well, the Pensions Investment Review sets out a clear direction of travel for pension schemes, which is they have to be bigger and better, whether that's through the defined contribution minimum asset size, or it's about the LGPS being moved down into 6 pools over the course of this year running up to March. When you come to the pension schemes bill, the basic premise of almost everything in that bill, I promise not to go through all 100 clauses, is to say the state is basically semi-hard encouraging people to save into their pensions. In that world, the onus is on us to make sure people are getting good value for money. through that scheme. And that means getting rid of the hassle, but also driving up returns. That's what the bill is doing, whether it's through getting rid of small pots, driving a focus on value for money, and to help us deal with this risks problem, requiring pension schemes to provide guided retirements. So you can't just leave people to face totally complicated decisions at the point of retirement, asking them questions they can't possibly be expected to wrestle with. And I think that will drive quite significant change, but it won't solve everything. It clearly won't solve the fact that currently only 55% of people are saving anything into a pension amongst working age people. So we do need to look at that. That broader review is what the Pensions Commission is all about, and it will set out recommendations in 2027 on what would make a stronger, fair and sustainable pension system for the middle of the 21st century. And I say I'm distinguishing here between work that is focused on pensioners today and what we should be doing as a government, which is making sure a pension system is there to deliver for generations that will retire in the middle of this century. And people say politics can't focus on long-term questions. Well, we are going to prove them wrong when it comes to this. And then just a wrap-up thought about why does all that matter? Well, all that matters because there is almost nothing more important to humans than the win that came in the 20th century from people having leisure at the end of a working life. Because for the rest of human history, people worked and then they died. And we are not going to be the generation that cocks it up.
It's good to hear, especially for those of us who be retired in 2050. Yeah. Victoria, what's the perspective of a provider on adequacy and also growth? And is that too much to ask from a provider?
I'm not sure this is working.
No, I don't think it
is
is. Is it not?
No, I don't think so. Hi, thanks. So just for those of you who don't know about People's Partnership, so People's Partnership operates the People's Pension, which is one of the largest defined contribution, which is DC master trust in the UK. We've got over 35 billion assets under management and over 7 million savers. We started off live providing insurance to the building and construction sector, and the majority of our savers are those low to medium earners. So adequacy is a really key issue for us. Just to say as well, because this feeds into the answering the growth question, so we're one of the fastest growing asset owners in the UK, and we expect to have 60 billion of assets under management in 2030. And importantly, we don't have shareholders. So all of our profits go back to our members. So to answer that question and to build on what the Minister said, growth and adequacy are not intentional. They don't have to be. And I think I'd just start by talking about the pension schemes bill. So I won't, again, like you, Torsten, go through the 100 clauses, but just to say, in terms of the pension schemes bill, it's massive. This is huge. It's transformational change that will come about in the pensions industry over the next 5 years and beyond. And so, as the Minister said, we're going to be creating fewer, bigger scale funds, as we see in Australia and Canada. Pensions are going to be allocating those funds to productive assets like infrastructure, property, supporting our scale-up businesses. And then we've got a range of other measures, again, as the Minister said, value for money and trying to deal with our small pots problem. So, many pension funds. And, we've got this massive change. And why have we got this massive change? So there's the challenges we talked about here. And it's because, it's about the money, right? So UK pensions have, industry holds a significant amount of assets. In DC, in DB, it's 1.6 trillion. In defined contribution, it's about 400 billion. And by 2033, it's going to be about 1 trillion. And so the government's quite rightly said, we're focusing our attention here because we can use this pool of assets to unlock growth. And, and also it's about recognition that we need to save more for our retirement. So we really support this drive at People's Partnership. And we made an announcement in January that we'd invest 4 billion into private markets. And we're also part of the Mansion House Accord. And this is a commitment of 17 pension funds to invest 10% of our assets into private markets and 5% of that into the UK. And we think that's right. And you were saying about pensioners in the future and pensioners just now. But we're not only saving for the benefit of pension funds into retirement, but also it can affect people's lives, their daily lives. So if we take large infrastructure projects, for example, these have many tangible benefits for local communities because we might be investing into better transport links, to availability of housing for local people and well-paid employment opportunities as well. But what I think the Minister has not heard this sector say for the first time, we do have to remember it's pensions members' money. We're investing here, and our main role is to deliver an income in retirement for the people who are saving with us. And whatever we do to increase investment in the UK also has to be in members' best interest. And that's not just something nice to do, it's a legal requirement of pension funds to do this. So when it comes to adequacy, because you've asked about growth and adequacy, and as I say, they both play in together, we do feel like we've got a really important role to play in this area. I mean, and one of the key things is to ensure that we have a pension fund that maximises savers' money, and we're delivering value for money. And you look to Australia, they're about a decade or 15 years ahead of us on its scale, consolidation, investment into private markets, and value for money journey. And this work has really delivered results. And we can see the average pension account balances in Australia have grown 8 times since 2002. And this is, the prize that we're going for here in the UK. This is what we're trying to achieve. But going back to the UK, and in terms of where we are now, as a workplace pensions provider, you'd expect us to say this, but auto enrolment has been an amazing success. We've got 11 million more people saving in workplace pensions than we did in 2012, and that's by making the pension opt-in rather than opt-out. But, and there's always a big but, right? We have 7 million savers at People's Partnership, and 2 million of those are actively saving. And the majority of those, almost all, are saving just at the minimum amount. And why is that? And it's because when we make a default, people assume that that's like the minimum, a recommendation for what they should be saving. But as we know, the Pensions Commission set what they felt was a minimum and expected extra contributions, and that hasn't come to pass. So this isn't something alone that the pension providers can fix, but we're really keen to work with government, keen to work with Pensions Commission to see what we can do to work together to deal with this challenge.
Thanks, Victoria. And we'll come to the audience some questions in a moment, so get your questions ready. Torsten, just picking up on that. So the government is encouraging pension funds towards investing in the UK, and the consolidation of those pension funds, like the LGPS, I can see is going to help bring money in. But there does also seem to be a conflict, as Victoria alluded to, between the fiduciary responsibility of a pension fund. And I think, do I want my pension holder putting my money into Thames Water because that's the patriotic drive that the government have directed, or do I want my money going into NVIDIA? And if you ask me, if you put money in one place 5 years ago, would that have been a better outcome for the UK or a worse outcome for the UK? So how do you see that challenge, that actually sort of what the pensions fund needs to do is to get the best return for the pension holder? And is that in conflict with what the government want, which is more money into UK PLC?
I mean, the simple answer to that is pension funds acting on the basis of fiduciary duty did put a load of money into Thames Water, didn't they? They did. That's what already happened under the current system. So it's I'm putting you into the. I'll come on to what I'm talking about, but I'm just pointing out that you made a silly point. I'm then going to move on to what I'm doing. But the point is, pension funds were large investors in Thames Water. Actually, not even just UK pension funds. While we're at it, so look, what's actually going on? Okay, we are setting out plans for larger and better pension schemes. Right? What's the logic chain that follows from that? And this is in savers' interests. That's what it's ultimately about. So why do you want them to be larger and better? It's not just because it makes everyone's life simpler, right? It's because larger and better schemes we can see around the world will be cheaper. And that is a really important thing, because one of the big drivers of returns for pension savers is the costs that a scheme holds. So there's just basic economies of scale arguments. Before I get to what the asset allocation is, right? Just basic economies of scale. Second reason, larger schemes are able to invest in a wider range of assets, which is what you're referring to. Why is that? Well, because one, risk bearing, but also two, the skills to do it well. Right? So to be able to invest in a wider range of private assets where you can take different liquidity risk, different profiles, you have the skills to invest in those asset classes, you need to be bigger. You should not be doing that as a small pension scheme. That would be a very bad of driving returns, right? So all of this is motivated by what is in pension scheme savers' interests. Then follow that through. If you had that, you had larger schemes investing in a wider range of assets, including private assets, what would we expect to see? Well, I would expect to see them investing in wider assets, and that's what pension schemes are saying is in their members' interest. That's what the Mansion House Accord is all about. So they're the ones saying this is in their interest. They're doing it because of that. The government is nodding along and supporting it. So the tension you're talking about goes into the made-up nonsense bucket. Then we say, right, what would happen if that did happen? Well, people would invest in a wider range of assets, and we know, looking around the world, that that you will tend to see a larger domestic bias in private assets than you will see in public assets, particularly in the UK case, I have to say. So it's not about forcing anybody to invest in the UK. As you see a move from larger schemes into private assets, I would expect to see a wider range of investment in UK private assets as part of that, because that's where UK pension schemes will probably find their comparative advantages relative to other kinds of institutional investors. But those are decisions for individual pension schemes to make. And I would say sometimes people talk as if the existence of finance is the same thing as investment. Okay, right. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about finance for investment. For that to actually turn into the investment that actually matters, then you need actual projects, actual investment to take place. Okay, you need a pipeline to match finance. Those two things together is what turns out as investment, higher capital stock, larger growth in the long term. And it's both that the government is doing. Like, why are we simplifying the planning system? Why are we changing how regulated sectors work so things actually get built? So there is a pipeline of investment. So that is how to think about the overall government's economic strategy, bringing together a pipeline of investment actually happening, and yes, making sure that that's available for UK pension schemes, but I'll tell you what, it's Australian and Canadian pension schemes that come through my door as often, and lots of other forms of institutional capital. That's what's going on, and that is in savers' interest. And when people say to me, oh, the status quo is absolutely perfect, any change to it is bad for members' interest, I say, one, that's nonsense. Everybody's admitting we should have been investing in a wider range of assets and be bigger for the future. And if you tell me the status quo is okay, then I think you're just wrong.
So questions from the audience? Yeah, James?
James Kirkup.
Just have to shout.
Right. James Kirkup, once upon a time the SNF. Sorry, I know we're talking about accumulation allocation, but I'm keen to pick up mainly on the minister's point about the decumulation point. Because, Torsten, you said it's impossible, through striking words, impossible for individuals to manage the longevity risk involved in DC accumulation. To the man on the street, who doesn't follow the ins and outs of pension policy, isn't it quite something to have a minister say, you know what, we are putting you individuals in an impossible situation. What are you going to do about that? I know you've got default accumulation pathways in place, but will it be necessary eventually, as we enter the old DC future, to go further? And I'm quite keen views from across the panel. Will that look like some sort of return to default annuitization, or what is the long-term future of accumulation look like?
Could everyone hear James's question? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'll just answer one question. So on James, I mean, I basically think it is not okay what we've done. Yeah, I think the best case you can make for where we've ended up is that we were so happy to get people saving anything into workplace pensions that we didn't worry about what came next. And when you step back, maybe that's a kind of reasonable thing, because remember, in the mid-2000s, everyone was saying workplace pensions are dead completely. Okay, so that's my being nice to the last 15 years, which is just really important to get going with actual savings. And most people retiring weren't relying on new small DC pots to get them through retirement. They may have had some parts of DB legacy pension schemes. They may have done a phase of their life in the public sector. So now, what do I mean it's not bearable? So the kind of longevity risk that's not bearable is individual longevity risk. It is imaginable that we could manage cohort longevity risk. The longevity risk that we have as a cohort that we don't know how long on average the whole cohort will live. You could collectivize that. That's manageable to a degree. You can't manage on your own the individual longevity risk because you're asking you will inevitably either run out of money at the end or underconsume early on. So I don't think that is actually controversial. The question is, what do we do about it? If we're honest, the state pension is a large part of what we do about that. That's what the system is providing. It's providing a total longevity protection for what for most people is a very, very substantial part of their retirement income. Remember, except for the very richest pensioners, the state pension is a very big deal. indeed. And then what we can do on the defined contribution side is make sure that we're planning ahead, and as we're looking for people to have, as they will, not least given the stat that Victoria told you all just now about what's happened in Australia about the growth of the average defined contribution pot, it will become the substantial basis of people's retirement. And before we get to that point, we need to have put in place these guided retirements that I'm talking about. And one of the elements of that is choice. So we're not talking about defaulting people into a particular product in the same way that we do want quite a hard default when it comes to auto enrollment. It's a softer default than that. And then maybe each scheme may choose a range of defaults for different groups of their cohorts, not least when they'll know whether they have other sources of income or not. But we do want to say and be clear that some degree of longevity protection is part of that. That definitely won't be everybody into an annuity, early on in their retirement in the way it was before. I don't think there's a case for going back to that, but we do need to be building systems that provide more of that. And to be fair, most schemes, long before this bill came along and I said it's going to include this in it, were already started to plan for that because that's what their members want.
Alexandra, guided retirement, is that something that you see as required?
I definitely agree people need a bit more support when it comes to retirement. I guess the average age of a DC pension is about 40, 42. That's based on my experience at L&G. So maybe there is a bit of time, but we do need to get on with it. I guess there's a point about people not having enough in their pension, but then when they get there, being able to use it as efficiently as possible. So maybe potentially a role for annuities at some point, at some age, not when you retire at age 65, 67, 68, but potentially as longevity risk increases relative to investment risk, annuities may well have a comeback.
Joanna?
Yeah, well, just to say that it is complex, this, isn't it, for people to manage. Most people are reluctant to talk about their fears and the risks that are involved in their pensions, and therefore don't seek advice or don't know where to seek advice or don't know how to seek advice. And so that's something to bear in mind. And also just to remind us all that, 1 in 8 pensioners have no income other than the state pension. And that for those people, that's a very different position. And of course, for single pensioners, that's worse. That rises to almost 1 in 5, and they're mostly women. I'll just read you something one of them told us. Since becoming reliant on the state pension, I'm in debt, go without food, and only put my heating on once a week when my grandchildren visit. So let's not forget about them too.
Thanks. Going back to the pension schemes bill, massive pension schemes bill. So there's as the minister said, there's some provisions within that on decumulation which we support People's Partnership, and really believe that and we're working as well on a guided retirement product. And I think this comes along with the issue of engagement, right? So we quite often get calls at People's Partnership 3 days before the person's about to get their pension. So we have to build a product which provides the solution without that engagement. So great if those individuals want to engage, but we have to build that into the process. So if you get to the end, then all of we build a product that fits purpose as best we can. Sorry, too many P's then. Thanks.
One here and then one there.
Hi, it's Anne from Hargreaves Lansdowne. I'll ask a question which I'm sure the Minister won't be in a position to comment on, but we've heard about the issues around engagement and getting people to contribute more. You've also got issues around retirement. We're encouraging people to build up decent pots of wealth so they can get a target replacement rate retirement. That's an issue for middle to high earners as well. A lot of high rate taxpayers also rely on state pensions, a key part of their planning. But how can you plan when there's such a big conversation about wealth taxes, a big conversation about pensions tax relief? How can you convince those people who are starting to engage with their pension in their 40s that what a wise decision for them would be to put away more money now, so it'll be good when you're 70, when you've got that wider environment? So how do we make, probably an easier question for the Minister is, how do we maintain trust in the system? I'm sure questions on tax are not an answer until the budget.
Let's take the other question as well, and then we can do both.
Thank you. I'm Marlies from the Finance Innovation Lab. I particularly appreciated comments from Alexandra and the Minister about needing a long-term big vision for pensions, and we've got this opportunity with various reform processes at the moment. And I wondered if the panellists agreed that if we're going to have decent, secure retirements in 2040, 2050, do we need three things actually? One, we need an effective pension system, collective, risk sharing, and so on. Two, we need a strong economy, and that's essential for raising living standards, particularly important for people who are poorer in older age. And three, we also need a safe climate and thriving natural world, and actually pensions policy can play a role in all of those three areas.
Okay, great. So one question on, does the talk around what the government might or might not do, does that have a dampening effect, and how do you deal with that? And I'm sure the Minister is not going to answer questions about what's in the budget, but there's a sort of question there about what, how do people take decisions, and how do those discussions affect those? And then the long-term big vision, and particularly not just that sort of collectivist or the growth economy, but also climate change, and how do we think about pensions in that context? Does anyone want to go first? Not the Minister. I'll give Torsten a chance to go second this time.
I can talk to the big picture, because I think that's really key to making pensions far more relevant to people. When I've had conversations with people, when you connect it to that bigger picture vision for retirement, that's when people get really interested and excited about it, and you don't have to just be a pensions nerd to contribute.
What are you calling a pension then?
But I think that people can engage with that. And I was reading something earlier this week about, changing pension plan to purpose plan. So the shift of like what you saving for and what does retirement look like for you and everybody else. And pensions is just one part of that. But it kind of plays to that longer term vision of what we're all striving for. So I think it's key in terms of cracking kind of engagement with pensions.
Yeah, I'm a sort of engagement fantasist or enthusiast, depending on how long you've been working as in the pensions nerd area. There seems to be a sort of collectivist view within the industry that there's a limit to how much engagement you can get, and that you sort of reach a dead end and be able to make change. But I'm much more positive about the potential for change and engagement over time, partly because the generation that are growing up now, they don't have that collectivist view of the pension. It's just money they're putting to their pot. It's their thing. So hopefully that will encourage them to think differently, but also because I think my generation are going to have this massive crunch. And when that happens and we're tearing our hair out, then hopefully the generation that's coming after us will look at us and say, how do I avoid that sort of crash that I think we're heading towards?
It's great that you're positive. Like it's like, and I think that's like, engagement is, we've seen the experience in Australia, haven't we? Where when we have a bigger pension funds, and that does drive engagement, because actually, that's like with this a bigger, 8 times the amount that they might have had. Like that's a really big pot there, which they can then start to engage with. The issue is that our experience tells us that engagement is the weakest lever that policymakers have. And people in our experience are remarkably resistant to engage with their pensions. So we do feel that, when we're making these changes, we do need a system that is automatic. So they can, so they can have options. So we need to build engagement into the system, but it needs to be, sort of systems in place so that we do get a good solution at the end. And as I say, it doesn't mean that we can't try. And we're seeing, as through the pension schemes bill, many changes which are going to make, significant changes here in the UK. We're going to have, sort of value for money metrics and dashboards, so that people will have systems of which they can engage with their pensions in a way that they just don't at the moment.
Joanna, do you want to come in?
I don't think I've got anything to add to that one. Thank you.
I think these two questions are actually really good to do together. So just briefly on engagement, what I would say is, I think we probably will. I'm not going to go all of you were edging into the hippy dippy end of the engagement optimism, but I think we'll get a long way there. And I think what will get us there is basically size of DC pots growing. Right? What did you see in Australia? It's not a linear relationship. Once the pots are like very material to people's financial wealth, their level of engagement went up hugely. That has some trade-offs, by the way. We don't want people actively kind of changing what shares are inside their pension pot on the back of like a bad day of news. So we want good engagement, not bad engagement. But you saw a more than linear growth with the size of the pot. I think you will see that. I think pension dashboard will also help on that front. So just to be positive on the engagement side. What we don't want is a system that means you're in danger of getting a bad outcome if you don't do that. That's the difference between the status quo and the world that we are trying to build. Then on this question on trust in the system, to state the blindingly obvious, there's some things we can't do, and we're not going to get rid of a free press just to stop some speculation. You need to talk to the journalists. It's not us driving any of that, just to be absolutely clear. We're not going to do that. What can we do? Well, I think we got the answer from the second question, which is provide a clarity of vision. That's what we're doing. We're saying this is what pensions are about. These are not just random savings pots. These are about providing pensions. That means we need to provide a system and a structure for people to understand them, and we need to provide guided retirements at the end. And I actually think, to be more positive, I actually think that this is a broad consensus. I actually think a lot of what we're doing with the bill and doing with the Commission is basically responding to a kind of latent consensus that was already basically building on the back of being, okay, we've now got people saving something, but we know we haven't built the full pension system. And what we're doing now is we're finishing the job. We're putting in the blocks that we're missing to make sure that we are providing adequate pensions, that we're doing everything we can to drive good value for money, and that we remove the complexity in the system, getting rid of small pots and the rest. I actually think the overwhelming majority of the industry knows that's the right thing to be doing. People will have kind of individual views on not liking different bits of the bill and others, and there's definitely people who have commercial interests. I totally appreciate that, and that's completely legitimate with different parts of the package. They'd rather weren't happening. But overall, I've not met people who are saying to me, oh, there's some other big vision that we should be heading towards. I basically think that consensus is there. I think that is a good basis on which to build trust. And I sometimes hear people saying to me, oh, but isn't somebody about to start means testing the state pension? And there's only one person in the entire country suggesting that, and that was Kelly Badnock, and even she stopped saying it now. So, the basic building blocks are there. We need to build on them, and we need to provide that vision. So in the middle of the century, people can see where we're heading towards.
I don't think it's hippy-dippy, but I'm still...
it's not. I think you're at hippy-dippy end of the engagement market.
Well, I still think Stacey Solomon is the answer to most problems. But I think if Stacey, does everyone watch Stacey Solomon Sort Your Life Out? Quick show of hands.
I love it.
That's what our lives are. So for those watching online, not a lot of hands went up, which is why people reach.
Stacey Solomon, she goes to someone's house and she sorts out their house for them. How nice would that be? And it's brilliant. It's such a cathartic experience. Stacey Solomon sorts out your pension pots. When we get to that, that's when we're at the hippy-dippy level where that will be transformational. And I think it will happen when we're in pensions crisis and Stacey Solomon will save the country's pension system. That is my secret plan. There's a question at the back.
I might not understand what this is, but I'll introduce myself. I'm Rishikesh Chakraborty. I'm a councillor in London Bonnet, and one more of us here. Cabinet Finance on the Chair of Pension Committee in Bonnet, and one of the, I think first of all, I think the Minister deserves some credit for enacting on the bond reform to try and see if we can improve funds, modelled on some of the successes we've seen in Australia and Canada. But I think there's two questions around risk that kind of stand out for you. So one is, in order for the bigger to translate into better, how do we sort of influence the culture of asset pools and associated institutions to try and increase their risk appetite to fund sort of the UK VC startup scene in areas that are actually Britain's core strengths, like life sciences, renewables, AI, this sort of thing. Because traditionally there's been a little bit of risk aversion. And the second thing is that this modelling that we do, based on the successes we've seen in Australia and Canada, the bigger and better results in fantastic returns over a 20-year period. Is there a risk, like that we're assuming that because in the last 20 to 30 years, in those markets, they experienced that growth, we're somehow assuming that that trend line will continue for the next 20 years? What assumptions are we making about the volatility index, especially when you look at some of the geopolitical tensions that are emanating from across the pond from other sources?
Yeah, good questions. Torsten, you want to take those?
Yeah, they're very good questions. Some of them are specific to the old GPS, but really we're here talking about just bigger schemes. How do they invest? So there's two bits I can particularly come back on. So the culture should be different in smaller and bigger schemes for the reason I was setting out before about what is the level of lumpy risk you can afford to bear, how much can you diversify your risk. So I think and what can you do efficiently. So I think you should be confident in terms of the higher returns that we should be confident come with scale. The lower costs, I think we should be very confident about being the case. We see that right around the world. It's not just about Australia and Canada. You see it within the UK. You see it everywhere. It's not surprising. Economies of scale do exist. There's a reason why Vanguard charges you next to nothing for a tracker. And if we're honest, going back to some points that were made about fiduciary duty earlier, we've seen too high charges historically in some very simple products that there wasn't any justification for. So I think bigger scale, we should be confident does that. I think you should be confident that it can drive investments in a wider range of assets, and that helps on a diverse. Forget for a second whether you believe that leads to higher returns per se. It definitely leads to diversification and risk reduction. So that's definitely desirable. Most of the modelling shows it will also lead to higher returns over time. But you are right to say that the past performance of the individual asset classes does not map onto, does not promise you that performance in future. Same for questions of geography. On the question of risk taking and VC in particular, I think that is an important question for us all to be thinking about. So I said to you earlier about where is the pipeline of products and how projects and how does that match to the finance provision that's available. And I think there is definitely a role both for the private sector and to a degree the public sector in thinking how can we intermediate between, how do we make sure there's an easier route for pension schemes which aren't about to go and become VC investors themselves? What is the intermediation that's required to make investment by institutional investors at scale, including pension funds, into via VC schemes in the UK easier and more prevalent? Because if you looked at where in our capital markets we have problems, it is absolutely certainly at the larger end of the VC market where we definitely see a lack of growth capital, and that is a problem for growth. And other countries are providing at the moment some of the VC capital in the UK. You should expect to see more of that being provided by our pension schemes and others in time, but it's on us and others and the private sector to find ways of doing that.
Victoria?
I mean, basically just what the minister said. So, sort of research and looking to, across the world, Australia, Canada, tells us that schemes of scale then do allow investment into private markets in a way that they don't before. And those investments in private markets do then bring benefits for increased pots for savers. That's what the research and experience tells us. When it comes to VC, in particular, as the minister said, we've got the experience here in the UK where we've got overseas pension funds investing more into UK VC than domestic pension funds investing into VC. So these are in terms of our scale-up businesses, those who are really driving innovation and really benefiting the economy, creating employment. We should be as a situation here in the UK where UK pension funds are investing into these types of businesses. The minister spoke earlier about sort of having the capacity to do that. And there is a capacity experience issue here in the UK, which, for example, People's Partnership, we have not yet, we're at the very start of our journey, but looking to invest into infrastructure and property, and then hopefully into other parts of the private market sector.
Great. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So take one, we'll take three. This will be the last three. So 1, 2, 3, we'll take three together.
Yeah, sorry, doubling your money on Barnet Council is asking you questions, so sorry about that. I suppose one of the reasons why late-stage VC tends to go to the States is because people want to IPO in the States, and so part as well as how do we have more liquidity in our own capital markets. I mean, if we stayed in the EU, maybe the capital markets union would have meant that people would look to a deeper, more liquid capital markets here in Europe rather than in the States. But my question was slightly different, which was, when we look at Canada and Australia, their CIOs get paid about 4 times what I made up 4. It's a lot compared to what ours are. And that's because they travel around the world finding the best private markets fund managers who don't need to give us their money. Like, you need to go and have relationships with them in Seattle or wherever they might be to persuade them to give you the opportunity to invest in them. previously in LGPS, we've been very good at saying we squeeze 10 bits off this product or whatever, and concentrated on fees rather than value for money. Is there a political journey that we need to take people on that actually value for money would be better spent giving a lot more money to our pools to raise wages and skills and attract the best into our pools? And actually that would be better for pensioners rather than trying to save money at the front end by paying low fees when you're going to attract the best talent into those pools compared to, for example, the superannuation funds or the Canadian pension funds.
EP10 from Standard Line. So my question is about a very important stakeholders in the whole picture, which is employers. So we are expecting them to do quite a lot in terms of pension advocacy. So they're contributing right now. They are also choosing the schemes that might or might not develop enough federal money for their employees. And they're also expected to hire more people in their later life if people can't retire earlier. So that's quite a lot. When we are talking to employers, they find it really difficult to balance all these responsibilities that they have. So my question is, how much should this actually be voluntary? How much should be compulsion? And how can we balance all this in the future pension commission's work?
Hi, I'm Joanna from the Telegraph. One for the Minister. Everyone's kind of in agreement that no one's saving enough into their pensions. So why have you ruled out increasing auto-enrollment contribution to this Parliament, leaving everyone a few more years of undersaving?
Okay, so why are we paying CIOs more? 4 times, 10 times, who knows?
That's inflation for you. Go from 4 to 10 in 1 minute.
The burden of responsibility that we're putting on employers is increasing. Do we see that as a voluntary or compulsory one? And auto-enrollment.
So we'll go through the panel and ask people to give a feedback on any of those. The one, I'll start with you, Torsten.
So on the first question, I mean, I think the answer is it is value for money that matters most, because that's what in the end matters for pension savers pots, and that is what the legislation we're taking through the House of Commons at the moment does. It's setting out the value for money framework. That doesn't mean the costs don't matter, including the pay of people working there. Those are costs, and higher costs means lower returns, all else equal. But those are the judgment schemes are going to have to make. I think in terms of the range of different people that will be working in these larger schemes, I think that will change over time. You're much more likely to see in-house investment capacity. And if you look around the world at what has happened as schemes have reached this kind of scale, we're talking about 25 to 50 billion pounds, then that's exactly what has happened. And that's what we'll be looking for as signs that people are making this adjustment well. And yes, that's a change, but the UK has more than its average share of those kinds of people. And when I talk, and not least, you've got a defined benefit sector that's also shrinking at the same time. So it's not like there aren't the kind of people around that you'll be wanting with the experience of making direct investments. I think different schemes will do that at different paces, and they'll probably start in different places. Some infrastructure, whether it's in VC, whatever it is, that you'll probably see people doing this at a different place in different ways, private credit, and the rest. And I think that's perfectly reasonable, different judgment to make about what they're doing in-house, and they're not over time. And in the other countries you mentioned, you still, yes, it's true, you've seen some of these changes happen, but you still see pressure on pay, people saying you shouldn't be earning that much, right? It doesn't change, the debate doesn't change fundamentally. On the question of, from the lady from Standard Life about employers, my experience, it is actually employers take it quite seriously and want to be part of providing for their employees. The paternalism in that sense is definitely not dead. I mean, you say we're expecting a lot of them. I mean, that's to a degree true in terms of making, automatic enrollment works through employers. And lots of employers want it that way. Remember, the alternative is a system in reality where each individual has a savings pot and every employer has to have a POA system that's able to channel funds to everybody's different savings pot. So this is the system that was, the CBI was heavily involved in the original Turner Commission for exactly that. That reason, the way in which it was implemented, the way compliance works in the system is generally in a kind of supporting businesses tone rather than a bashing them over the head compared to the compliance regime in other parts of the legislative framework. And the answer to the lady from the Telegraph is that's why we've got a commission. So that's what we're going to do. But I'm not waiting in terms of taking action on adequacy. Like the state pension is rising. We're taking action now to make sure we're raising rates of return for pension savers. There's lots going on right now. It is true that we'll be waiting for the Pension Commission to do its work, because you do need to think about this in the round. And sometimes people say to me, "Oh, we know exactly what we need to do," and then I say to them, "What is the exact answer to solving the self-employment problem?" And then they start mumbling words about tax. Remember, how long did it take the last government to launch the Pension Commission? 4 or 5 years into that Labour government. We're a year in, it's launched, it's underway, and we're going to change the system.
Alexandra, do you want to come in?
Just quickly on the employer point, I concur with the Minister that I work with many employers who are really concerned with pensions adequacy, and work with them to understand the numbers, who's on track, who's not, and they're very keen to look at pension scheme design and what they can do in order to shift the narrative and make more people get over a certain level of adequacy. In terms of the AE, just a thought, chuck into the Pensions Commission, I've been looking at the states and auto-escalation. Save More Tomorrow has been fantastic in terms of getting more people contributing higher amounts over time and kind of tackling the behavioural issues. We have many people stuck at a default rate that may be potentially too low to deliver the dignified retirements that they need.
Thank you. Just a couple of thoughts. So on employers, I agree with what's been said already. I think that there are really good employers out there who take this seriously and want to make it work. And actually, as importantly, employees want and need them to do that. And I think, youngsters who are joining the workforce now expect much more from employers than they used to, and they're right to. So it's a serious business and they need to take it seriously. And then just on the auto-enrolment point, it's great that we've got the Pensions Commission up and running. They've got such an important job to do. And, for all of us, we need to understand what an adequate income in retirement is. But for the people we look after, and of course, that's for most people, that's got lots of different strands to it. But for people right at the bottom, that's even more important. So, yeah, great it started, and we're all going to be looking at that with great interest.
I'm in violent agreement with everything that's been said.
Well, we're at time, so please give a round of applause to the panelists. We have a pensions review forum at the Social Market Foundation, which is a sort of bi-monthly self-help group stroke sort of policy development hippy-dippy area. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, do get in touch. We also have, I'm going to give a plug to our weekly email, which is called Wonk Week, which we read all of the think tank reports every week so that you don't have to, and we summarize them in an email and we send them to you. And people who subscribe to Wonk Week love it, and I strongly recommend it. And you can find it at smf.co.uk, and I'm told it's on the back of the thing on your chair as well as a QR code there. So please subscribe to Wonk Week and have a great evening. Thank you.